We've been talking about EC Comics, and you can't talk about EC Comics, really, you can't, without talking about the horror genre. And as I said before, EC was not the only company. They weren't the first and they weren't the only to be putting these books out, although they were the most famous. In fact, as of 1952, there were about 20 comic book companies. And those 20 companies put out a combined 650 different titles per month. Out of those 650 or so comic book titles each month, more than one-third of them, well over 200, were horror. So I've taken the opportunity to show you some of the non-EC and non-Marvel / Timely / Atlas horror comics. Well, by the late 1940s, there were already a handful of parents groups and of church groups who were getting up in arms about the increasing violence in comics. And there had been a handful of instances of public burning of comic books by these groups. But the one individual whose name is most closely associated with the anti-comic book movement was this guy, Dr. Frederick Wertham, a psychologist originally from Germany who specialized in child psychology and actually specialized even more specifically in dealing with troubled children, particularly children who had gotten in trouble for criminal activity. Now, post-World War II, the term juvenile delinquency started to show up all over the place. There had always been misbehaved kids, but now there was some degree of paranoia about it and a lot of hand-wringing to figure out what was the cause. Now, Wertham had done, and would in the future, after the late 40s, would do a lot of very good things. Okay, he was one of the only psychologists working with black school children in Harlem as early as the 1920s. He had a free child psychology clinic. He did a lot of anti-racism work, a lot of work about children's self-image and the importance of that. And in fact, some of his work in that area was used as testimony in the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education that ended school segregation in 1954. So, all that being said, to comics historians and comics fans who know a lot about the history of the medium, he's kind of the bad guy of the story. And that's because he really did stir things up in a big way. All right, well, when he was working with children, particularly children who had gotten in trouble with the law in New York City in the 1940s, he started to take notice of entertainment. He actually had things to say about mass communications and entertainment in general, but more specifically with comic books. And what he discovered was that all of the juvenile delinquents that he treated, almost all of them, seemed to read comic books. Therefore, comic books must cause juvenile delinquency. Well, if you've been paying attention at all so far, you'll know that almost all kids read comic books. We saw the numbers, right? It's 90-some%, boys and girls. So the fact that all juvenile delinquents read comics was really an indication that they were all juveniles and read comics like the rest of the juveniles. That's like saying, all the juvenile delinquents, almost all of them rode bicycles, so bicycles must cause crime. But he took some took some extended notes, did some research, and concluded that comic books were a large cause, a major cause of children turning to crime and being disturbed. He felt that there were bad role models, that their brains were being damaged by the stuff that they were reading. He felt like they were imitating the stuff that they saw in comics because they were unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. He thought that it was just entirely too blasé in how things were presented to children, and he started talking about it a lot in some very public places. Wertham first got a national audience in May 1948 when his article, "The Comics, Very Funny," appeared in the Saturday Review of Literature and shortly thereafter was reprinted in Reader's Digest. There was another big article in November 1953 that was in Ladies' Home Journal called "What Parents Don't Know About Comic Books." And that one was kind of a teaser for his book that was due out about 6 months from then. And it sort of captured some of the highlights of that and captured the attention of the public in a national magazine, which of course helped the sales of his book, which came out in April 1954. It was called "Seduction of the Innocent: The Influence of Horror Comics on Today's Youth." The book was, it was comprised of text of Dr. Wertham's psychological opinions and reportings of his research and findings, but also liberally sprinkled throughout with illustrations such as these to show you what he was talking about. So here on this one, he's demonstrating. Well, he has his captions let you know what he's getting at. "Treating police contemptuously is a comic book commonplace." Now, so there's some cops being shot at and so forth. There's that page. Also, he made complaints about the representation of women in comics and the hypersexualized appearance of many female characters, as well as its potential effects on body image of young girls and its potential effects on the images of sex of some young boys, and not just the image, not just the women's figures, but the sexual situations, such as on the upper left, this drawing in which the guy in the foreground is holding a gun. The idea is that that doesn't look like a gun from that angle, right? And the lady's saying, where you going on a night like this, Tony? You ain't gonna shoot anybody with that rod, are you? And then the caption here to the upper right: "Children told me what the man was going to do with the red hot poker." Then the bottom right there, these criminals who are draining the blood from a female victim, and he's comparing that to the forbidden pages of Desaad. And some more images, which maybe the one on the left is familiar because we've seen it on the cover of one of the EC comics, as well as, I find this interesting, the caption there with the silhouette of the Statue of Liberty from a crime comic, and the narration says, "Joe Vanna ran far. He ran to America. He recalled the names his father had mentioned. He knew where to go, to this fence, to that gun cellar, It wasn't long before Joe Vanna acquired a reputation, and Wertham's caption for that is, "What Comic Book America stands for," saying that this story and the actions of this character represent what the comic book companies essentially stand for. Then in the lower right, this picture has become famous as a result of Wertham. His caption, "A sample of the injury to the eye motif," and here's this young lady who's being threatened to have her eyeball popped with a hypodermic needle. That's fun stuff. That image was not from an EC horror comic. It was from True Crime Comics by Magazine Enterprises, I think was the publisher. July 1948. Written and drawn by Jack Cole, who was still doing Plastic Man at the time. It's a story about the travails of a young woman who becomes a dope fiend, and I thought I would show you these first couple of pages just in case you were worried about her, because she doesn't lose her eye. The neighbors scare off her attacker, but then, more horrible things happen to her. Anyway, in addition to the violence, there were other things in addition to the violence and the hypersexualized images of women. There were other things that Wertham found disturbing about comic books, and he didn't confine himself, despite the subtitle, didn't confine himself to horror or even crime. He even looked at the big three superheroes, who were the superheroes who were still around by 1954 when the book came out. So what could he have? What problems could he have with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman? Well, I kind of hinted at this sometime earlier when I said that people would, by the late 1940s, start making some assertions about the appropriateness of the relationship between Batman and Robin. Right? Robin is the ward, the legal guardian of Bruce Wayne, Robin being Dick Grayson. Not adopted, so it's not a father-son relationship. Both of them were orphans, by the way, parents killed by crime. But Wertham found this, he found it very problematic, and he pointed to several instances of things that were disturbing, beyond just the fact that, it was a grown man and apparently like a 14-year-old boy or so living together in opulent luxury. He actually pointed to that, the fact that they were in a mansion and that it was tastefully decorated with lots of flowers and stuff. He called it sort of like the dream world of a homosexual couple. And beyond that, beyond the stuff about, the cave, and I don't think at that time they had added the bat poles that they used to slide into the cave. Not that I'm aware of. Maybe they had. One of the things that Wertham pointed to was the fact that despite the fact Bruce Wayne is portrayed as kind of a debonair playboy who always has some high society lady on his arm, he does not seem that interested in actually pursuing those relationships, almost as if they are only there for show. And you can see that in the upper left. You can also see in the panels on the right some things that could, in isolation, be pointed to and described as a little hinky. Although DC Comics insisted, and Bob Kane and Bill Finger insisted, that the relationship between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, although not father and son, was very much like father and son. Now also, here's a quote from Wertham describing Robin. It says, "Robin is a handsome, ephebic boy. usually shown in his uniform with bare legs. He often stands with his legs spread, the genital region discreetly evident. Now, a couple of words that need defining here. Ephebic, that one sent me to the dictionary the first time I saw it. So let's take a look at the official definition of that. Ephebic. Ephebic, pertaining to a young man or to early manhood, especially in ancient Greek contexts. It is, in fact, a Greek word. So, ephebic, a young man, just out of adolescence, often in the context of ancient Greece. And, if you're not familiar, you probably are familiar, but the idea of an older man and a very young man as couples was socially accepted at various times in ancient and classical Greece. Now, the other word I wanted to look at was discreetly. It said that his genital region was discreetly evident. Now, it matters how that word is spelled, and I've found that more and more often nowadays, students misunderstand that word. People in general don't know there's two different words spelled differently. So, the word used there, most people assume discreetly means discreet with two E's, which means careful and circumspect in one's speech or actions, especially in order to avoid causing offense or to gain an advantage. But that's not the word. It was not discreet with two E's. It was, discreet with two E's, but not next to each other. Discreet with one E, which means something completely different. It means individually separate and distinct. So in this particular context, when Wertham's talking about discreetly, the word he used means the opposite of being discreet, in the sense that probably most of you associate that word. All right, well, another thing that Wertham pointed to as problematic and evidence of homoerotic undertones was this panel. See, there's Bruce Wayne's kind of staring off dreamily, and he's in his apparently in his smoking jacket, and there's young Dick Grayson saying something's wrong with Bruce. He hasn't been himself these past few days. And Wertham, in his book, pointed to the undue amount of concern that Dick Grayson had for Bruce Wayne's well-being is clearly gay. That's kind of ridiculous, right? That's kind of reinforcing a lot of those stereotypes that any kind of emotion is a marker against masculinity. And like I said, the previous panels, taken out of context and described the way they were, can mean one thing, doesn't necessarily mean that's what the writer and artists were aiming for in those instances. But what Wertham said was that in addition to his own observation, that some of his patients, some of his teenaged patients who were homosexual, identified strongly with Dick Grayson and had kind of a wish to be Dick Grayson and therefore be able to have sex with Bruce Wayne. That's what he claimed. Now, that's the problem with Batman. What problem could he have with Wonder Woman? Well, you could just imagine he went to town on that one. But one thing he really focused on a lot was the idea that, Batman and Robin are going to turn your little boys gay. Wonder Woman's going to turn your little girls gay. Because Wonder Woman is clearly, he said, supposed to be a lesbian and sort of supports the idea of that being something that young girls could aim for. Superman, there's no gayness in Wertham's argument about Superman. No, what he said about Superman was he's a fascist thug. Goes around beating on people, breaking the law, and that this is evidence of what he called a Superman complex that children can get, where they fantasize about being invulnerable and therefore escaping any consequences and being able to take delight in viciously punishing people. In fact, Wertham said that Superman, he has that S on his chest. It should be two S's for SS, as in Nazis. And in fact, he said that Hitler was a mere beginner compared to comic book publishers. Well, from what you know, just from what we've talked about the background behind the creation of Superman, it's sort of like the opposite of Nazi, in as much as it is more of a Jewish self-defense fantasy wish fulfillment than it is a fascistic one. And again, Superman, at least in the 30s and early 40s, was very much anti-fascist, not just in the sense of being against Nazis, but in the sense of having a communitarian spirit. Well, nonetheless, these points were made. Now, he didn't really say a lot of bad things about funny animal comic books. So Donald Duck and Huey, Dewey, and Louie, they got off easy. Did Wertham's publicity campaign for his book get public attention? Well, judge for yourself. 2 days after the book came out, there were congressional hearings held by the Congressional Subcommittee that was investigating juvenile delinquency, the Senate Subcommittee. This whole thing, it was 2 days long. 2 days of hearings and then another day, about a month later, into whether or not horror and crime comics caused juvenile delinquency. So essentially the entire Senate shut down for 2 days to talk about comic books. This was, part of it was televised. This was hot on the heels of the Senate investigations of the mafia that had been fully televised. And it was led by the same guy, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee, who in 1952 had unsuccessfully run for the Democratic nominee as president. So anyway, they call in a bunch of expert witnesses. They've got about 24 large blown-up posters around the Senate chamber with many of the images that we've already looked at. They've got kind of a gallery of covers, as you can see right here. And like I said, they've got many of the images we've already looked at. One that we haven't looked at that's worth mentioning is from an issue of EC's Haunt of Fear, a story called Foul Play, about these two baseball teams. The pitcher from Central City had had poisoned the spikes on his cleats, and intentionally, and stomped down on one of the players of the opposing team, Bayville, and therefore murdered him. And the teammates of the murdered man figured it out and came up with a ruse to get the pitcher, Herbie Satin, to come to the ballpark at midnight, whereupon they killed him and sort of dismantled him and used his organs to play baseball, right? So they've got his heart and his lungs as the bases and his intestines marking the baselines and his head as the ball. Good times, good times. Also entered into evidence this full-page humorous public service announcement from that month's issue of The Haunt of Fear from EC Comics. So we're going to zoom in, take a close look at this. Are you a red dupe? In the town of Gazuski, in the heart of Soviet Russia, young Melvin Buzenskine-Skavitsky published a comic magazine. So they came and smashed his four-color press and hung poor Melvin the next morning. Here in America, we can still publish comic magazines, newspapers, slicks, books, and the Bible. We don't have to send them to a censor first, not yet. But there are some people in America who would like to censor, who would like to suppress comics. It isn't that they don't like comics for them, they don't like them for you. These people say that comic books aren't as good for children as no comic books, or something like that. Some of these people are no-goods. Some are do-gooders. Some are well-meaning, and some are just plain mean. But we are concerned with an amazing revelation. After much searching of newspaper files, we've made an astounding discovery. The group most anxious to destroy comics are the communists. We're serious, no kidding. Here, read this. And here they have some quotes from the Daily Worker, communist magazine from 1953, talking about comics brutalizing America's worth and the child's America's youth and the child's natural character, and so on and so forth. And they conclude then, that is to say the editors, the EC editors, they conclude, so the next time some joker gets up at a PTA meeting or starts jabbering about the naughty comic books at your local candy store, give him the once-over. We're not saying he is a communist. He may be innocent of the whole thing. He may be a dupe. He may not even read the Daily Worker. It's just that he's swallowed the red bait. Hook, line, and sinker. Now, I hope that your irony alert is on and that you see what's going on here. The implication of a lot of things in McCarthy-era United States is that anything that doesn't conform to the status quo must automatically be communism, therefore irrevocably evil. Now, the editors at EC, who have made a lot of statements against McCarthyism, are sort of turning things around and saying, oh yeah, well maybe you're the communist, essentially, since you're trying to censor the public exchange of ideas. On the afternoon of the first day of testimony, the Senate called their star witness, Dr. Frederick Wertham.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency.
Dr. Wertham was asked to respond to the humorous editorial in EC Comics about Are You a Red Dupe? To which he responded, that was in a comic book, so I didn't read it. To respond to Dr. Wertham's testimony, the Senate called William Gaines, publisher of EC Comics.
2 decades ago, my late father was instrumental in starting the comic magazine industry. He edited the first few issues of the first modern comic magazine, Famous Funnies.
Famous what?
Funnies. I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wertham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
Gaines had volunteered to testify because he was gung-ho to defend his company and his industry. He was scheduled to testify in the morning, and he was taking diet pills, amphetamines. And he had taken a dose before he was supposed to go on, so he was he was good and wound up. Except he didn't go on when he was supposed to, because the morning's testimony kept dragging on and he got bumped into the afternoon. And so when he started testifying, which we heard the beginning just now, he was still very energetic and very gung-ho. But as his testimony continued and his questions were asked of him, the amphetamine started to wear off and he started to come down really hard. And he started, his speech was a little slurred, his reactions were slow, and maybe he wasn't thinking as clearly as he had been when he started. And this was the worst possible time and the worst possible venue for something like that to happen. And all that led to this infamous exchange between Gaines and Chief Counsel Herbert Beezer, in which Gaines did way more harm than good. So, Beezer said, "Let me get the limits as far as what you put into your magazine. Is the sole test of what you would put into your magazine whether it sells? Is there any limit you can think of that you would not put in a magazine because you thought a child should not see or read about it?" Gaines said, "No, I wouldn't say that there's any limit for the reason you outlined. My only limits are the bounds of good taste, what I consider good taste." Beezer, "Then you think a child cannot in any way, shape, or manner be hurt by anything that a child reads or sees?" Gaines, "I don't believe so." Beezer, "There would be no limit, actually, to what you put in the magazines." Gaines, "Only within the bounds of good taste." Beezer, "Your own good taste and saleability." Gaines, "Yes." Senator Kefauver says, "Here's your May 22 issue. This seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. Do you think that's in good taste?" Gaines, "Yes, sir, I do, for the cover of a horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so that the neck could be seen dripping blood from it, and moving the body over a little further so the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody." Kefauver, "You have blood coming out of her mouth." Gaines, "A little." Kefauver, "Here's blood on the axe. I think most adults are shocked by that." And in fact, most readers of the next day's newspaper were shocked by that and by Gaines' really ineffective defense of it. More than 65 years after that testimony, history regards Bill Gaines quite kindly. History regards Dr. Frederick Wertham quite unkindly. In fact, in 2010, Dr. Wertham's notes and research material was finally made available to the public. And in 2012, after 2 years of looking through those materials, Carol Tilley, then an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, published a groundbreaking article in an academic journal in which she demonstrated quite convincingly that Frederick Wertham's experiments and his research and his conclusions were mostly just made up, mostly just fabricated or exaggerated. But the fact is, Bill Gaines has been dead for 28 years, so that doesn't help him much. Nor does it help the comic book industry of the mid-1950s, which was going to suffer considerably as a result of these things. Now, by the time all was said and done, by the time this testimony was over, about 70% of American adults believed that comic books must be a large factor in the spread of juvenile delinquency. And by 1955 or so, there were about a dozen states that put laws on the books censoring comic books as material for children. This book, which came out in 1999, The 10-Cent Plague, is an excellent history of the congressional hearings about comic books. Actually, it's an excellent history also of the early years of the comic book industry, because it explains all that, lays that out kind of as the background and context. I assign this book often. I assign it frequently in my modern U.S. history classes, just the lower division class. And students usually enjoy it, not always, but they usually have one of two reactions to the book and to the material inside. This book includes a lot of illustrations. Either they are absolutely shocked at the extent of the violence that was being portrayed in those comic books and sympathetic to Wertham, or they equate what was going on in the 1950s with comic books with what they themselves in their lifetime have seen go on with video games, and are more sympathetic to William Gaines. But if you find this subject interesting, I highly recommend that book.